Hello, everybody. This is Miss Peachy from your WCA Biology B class. And here we are finally in Unit 8. Unit 8, Lesson 2, Biological Evolution Evidence. Our key terms here are amino acids, proteins, gene, common ancestry, last universal common ancestor, phylogenetic tree or chart, cladogram, and taxonomy. So again, as always, we do have linked below the video here. You will see a link to kind of a notes guide, study guide that goes along with this lesson. So let's go into it, shall we? It starts off by saying you may have heard the phrase, all life is connected. And so when you study evidence of evolution, what you're going to find if you trace it far enough back, it will stem from one common, universal common ancestor at the earliest form of life. And so that's kind of what is represented here in this phylogenetic tree. You can see it's a very beautiful, very fluid looking thing. It's not complete. You don't have all living things on Earth here, but it does kind of give you main categories of things. And what you're going to notice here too is there's different lengths for branch points. The nodes occur at different points along the way. We can zoom in on this a little bit too, and we kind of see that there's certain characteristics. Remember, we called those derived characteristics that certain organisms have in common. For example, the placenta is only in common with these groups up here. And cows aren't the only mammal that falls in this group here too, but these all share that characteristic, that derived characteristic, right? But the lengths of the branches kind of represent the amount of time that has passed here as well. So even though sometimes we can look at physical similarities to help us to determine ancestry, a lot of times physical similarities aren't going to give us the whole picture. Obviously, you look at a human and a banana, for example, and they don't look anything alike at all. However, we can notice similarities in their DNA and their deoxyribonucleic acid. So this is your hereditary information, your molecule that carries genes. So genes are just chunks of your DNA. DNA is a long sequence of A, T's, C's, and G's, and certain sequences or certain chunks within there are called genes if those chunks code for a protein. Proteins are made up of amino acids, so the gene, as it's transcribed and then translated, will produce amino acids, and then those amino acids will be linked together to form proteins. Once you have your chain of amino acids, it is folded and twisted up into the right shape to make a protein. So a protein is a large molecule made up of amino acids. And what we can see is about 50% of the genes found in the human DNA are also comparable to those found in banana DNA. So we share about 50% of our genes in common. And so this is some evidence to say that we have some relationship with a banana. I mean, we have a very like weak relationship. It's been a very long time since bananas and humans shared the same common ancestor, right? The fewer genes you share in common with something, the much longer ago it was that that common ancestry was shared. To contrast this, we share over 99% of our genes in common with a chimpanzee. And so that has been a much more recent relationship than we had with the banana. Another evidence of common ancestry is simply deoxyribonucleic acid all by itself. The fact that all living things on Earth use DNA as its hereditary molecule suggests that we all have common ancestry as well, because we're all reliant upon the same molecule to transmit our genes from one generation to the next. So looking at amino acids, these are the building blocks of proteins. They are made up of three different components. They have what's known as the amino group, which is this NH2. They have the carboxyl group, which is the COOH. And then they have what's known as a side chain. And that side chain contains carbon, hydrogen, and or oxygen. So that side chain is really what makes each amino acid different. You can kind of see here. These are the different side chains, and this is, you can kind of see them represented here in the red, right? Notice that the part that's in the black is the same for all. NH2, OOH here, that's the same for everything, right? But what's in red varies. It makes glycine different from leucine, different from tryptophan, different from alanine, different from isoleucine, different from methionine, different from valine and phenylalanine and proline, and asparagic, acid, glutamic acid, lysine, arginine, histidine, serine, threonine, cysteine, asparagine, glutamine, tyrosine. So we can kind of see all the differences, although we also have similarities in them as well. When you put amino acids together, they make proteins, and different sequences code for different orders of amino acids, which creates different proteins. So again, this process is the same, and so we can see that this process to make proteins is the same for all living things as well, and that's also evidence of having a common ancestor. Okay, so then they're going to talk about how we look at this, right? We look at DNA and proteins and amino acids amongst living things. We can use a structure known as a cladogram, which looks like this. It's similar to a phylogenetic tree, but it's showing us hereditary relationships instead. So when we look at a cladogram, it's actually a type of phylogenetic tree. All relationships are linked back to a common ancestor. In a cladogram, however, the length of the lines here do not represent time at all. So the longer the line doesn't necessarily represent that it's been quicker. And you can see tree species that have closer branch points compared to other species are said to have a more recent common ancestor. So, for example, elephants and aardvarks have a common ancestor that's more recent than an elephant does with, say, a whale. Every place you see a little node here, that's a common ancestor. So this is when they shared a common ancestor. Cows and whales shared a common ancestor here, but they didn't share a common ancestor with a pig. Here, they shared it with a pig back here. So they are more closely related than cows, and whales are more closely related than cows are to pigs, according to this cladogram. Does that make sense? Because the branch point or the node here is closer to the picture, that means more closely related or more recent in time. So all these are related to each other by some common ancestor, which forms the root of the tree. So again, we have a common ancestor, and that kind of goes along with what we have been learning, universal common ancestor. Okay, moving on to a different section here in this lesson. We just kind of review a bit of the study of taxonomy. We've done this before. So remember our 6 kingdoms, and we have our 3, domains, and these 6 kingdoms can be divided down into phyla, class, order, family, genus, species. So some of the reasons we use this is, some of the reasons why we divide them is through just what they look like, common characteristics that they share. So, but we also can analyze DNA, protein, and amino acid sequences to help determine taxonomic groups as well. So it's not just how they look nowadays, it's also an analysis of their DNA that determines which groups they belong to. And they kind of gives an example here. For example, this graph shows that, let's see here. We're going to look at this graph here. It says this graph is showing that amphibians, reptiles, and birds and mammals all branched off from a common ancestor around 250 million years ago. So right here, right? However, birds and mammals share a common ancestor from around 200 million years ago. So we can kind of see another branch point right here, right? So this is what we would say is a type of phylogenetic tree, because it's showing us common ancestry as well. But it also gives us this y-axis of time. And even though this isn't always given, when you look at a phylogenetic tree, it's always implied as well. So whenever we see that, we can determine that this is in time. So this occurred earlier of an event. This is more recent. This is even more recent. And the lengths of the lines correspond to how long ago it actually was. All right, so one of the last things they talk about here is other evidence of common ancestry. For example, how do you determine when a species split from one another? You do this using fossil evidence. You can use geological evidence to place fossils into certain time periods. You can then look for which time periods contain which fossils to determine when a certain species came into existence and possibly split from another. Unfortunately, the fossil record is not very complete, so we can't always use fossils. So while fossils do work somewhat, they're not perfect. But another way we can use is something called a molecular clock. So there's a theory that suggests that most mutations are actually neutral mutations. They're not bad and they're not good. So bad mutations will cause you to die, and you probably won't pass those on to the next generation, so they'll just kind of be gone from the fossil record. Good mutations are what drives evolution. But there's also mutations that happen that really have no effect on an animal's fitness at all, but they're still present. And so those mutations can be passed on to your offspring, even though they're part of your genome, even though they're not helping you, they're not hurting you either. So they just get carried on from one generation to the next. So if you can recognize a neutral mutation, and you can find the genome or the gene sequence for it, right? You can trace that mutation back to older and older generations to see kind of when did that neutral mutation take place. And we can kind of use it as a clock to determine how long ago it happened. And if certain species of animals have that mutation that are not the same species, we can determine when they were last the same species, because they would have had to have been the same species in order for them all to have that same neutral mutation. Does that make sense? They all got it at one point from their parent species, and then when they eventually branched off into different species, they still carried that neutral mutation with them because it wasn't helping them, it wasn't hurting them at all, but it gives us a clock to kind of measure when that happened. So you can use the fossil evidence, you can use these molecular clock evidence as kind of a timeline to help us determine when this stuff happened in time. And it's pretty cool if you ask me. So that's pretty much it from this lesson, everybody. If you have questions, of course, let me know. I'm always here to answer them. I will see you all in the next one. Take care.